Italy. Home of the Renaissance, the core of the Roman Empire, and least of the European great powers. Since its inception in the 1860s, Italy had great appetite but rotten teeth, to steal a phrase from Bismarck. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Italy was seen careening into anarchy for the next 1,000 years. From the Byzantine reconquest and the Lombard invasion creating permanent and visible north-south division, to the feudal Carolingian kingdom being constantly unstable, and the subsequent decline of the Holy Roman Empire, leaving the region dominated by city-states and outside powers, Italy had a pretty bad hand when it was unified. The country would spend the next 80 years trying to claim a place in the sun, with attempted colonial expansion, wars against Austria, and even considering itself a rival to France. However, the Kingdom of Italy would struggle. But this, of course, begs the question, what if Italy was more successful, able to push for more with better outcomes? In short, what if history went perfectly what if Italy was a superpower? Well, to start with, we need to figure out what that means. For example, an Italy that avoided the medieval disintegration would have different aims and economic concerns than one that emerged in the 1600s somehow, and that would be different than the modern Kingdom of Italy. So we're specifically sticking to scenarios after the defeat of Napoleon. The earliest point we can use would probably be the First Italian War of Independence. Now, this is part of the revolutions of 1848 and is a right old complicated mess. There were factions of Italian nationalists who wanted to unite with Sardinia-Piedmont due to its recent liberalization, others who wanted a federal Italian republic, some who just wanted rights without this whole United Italy business, and then there's King Ferdinand of the Two Sicilies, who just wanted one of his Sicilies back. However, the deck is frankly stacked against the revolutionaries here. The Italian army is about as coordinated as a drunk college party, the Austrians have the support of the papacy and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, and for good measure, France is here to stop the revolutionaries from conquering Rome. However, it gives us the best chance of making Italy into a premier European power due to the head start, so we're going to work with it the best we can. Most of the Italian states had created republics as the revolutions forced their monarchs to flee or abdicate, and they debated on unification with Italy. However, what we'll do is have King Victor Emmanuel I declare himself King of Italy during the chaos of the Revolutionary War, hoping to gain legitimacy by forcing the revolutionaries to pick between being divided or his monarchy. I wouldn't say that it's sure to work, but such a gamble might be able to play to the chaos gripping the region. In addition, Sicily declared itself a kingdom while also seeking unification of Italy under a confederation, so they would likely be willing to go with Victor Emmanuel's plan. The Roman Republic would be more difficult since its de facto leader, Giuseppe Mazzini, was a more devout Republican and social democrat, and considering that he would later be a constant critic of the Savoyard monarchy, he's not likely to change his tune. However, one of his partners in the triumvirate government of Rome, Carlo Armellini, was a more moderate man. If there is an established kingdom calling for a unified Italy, then he might be willing to play ball. As a result, we can assume there's a provisional alliance among the revolutionaries to fight under a united banner. From here, the problem is mostly France. Louis Napoleon, who definitely isn't about to coup the government, is at this point hostile to Italian unification because it would require the conquest of Rome and is a threat to the papacy as a result. This is a lot harder to shake off than anything else, especially with the absorption of the Roman Republic. So, how do we fix it? Well, the easiest way is to mess with the 1848 presidential election and keep him out of power. Okay, well, having him be assassinated would be easier, but I do it all the time. So, in our timeline, Napoleon would win well over 70% of the vote in nearly every district. However, this is because the monarchists couldn't figure out a viable candidate from either the Orleanists or Legitimists, the Republican right was disliked due to actions taken during the Revolution, and Napoleon, despite lacking a lot of history, was able to play himself as a benefactor of the poor and the workers, while also being too nationalistic and Bonapartist to allow for a proto-socialist revolution. So what are we going to do here? Well, clearly the monarchists need to support literally anyone other than Napoleon, and for that, our best bet is probably Henry of Chambord, the legitimist claimant. The Orleanists, after all, are the ones that France just got rid of. In addition, we need another actual Republican, and for that position, I'm turning to Alphonse de Lamartine, who was a leader in the revolution. He did run in real life, but because of Napoleon accidentally creating the perfect coalition, he got smacked. With the monarchist split, however, I think that Lamartine has a pretty decent shot. After all, the left-leaning Republicans will probably go to him as a base, the monarchists will be divided and unable to orchestrate an entire vote, and the Party of Order, the main conservative party, stayed neutral in the election, which I kept. And Lamartine, being a more left-wing candidate and a Republican, is unlikely to support the reactionaries. However, he is still more involved in Catholicism politically and socially, so he probably would still denounce the annexation of Rome, if only to save face. Now, this has huge implications for French foreign policy, which was at this time very personally driven by Napoleon III, as well as transforming Paris into other cities, since Louis Napoleon was critical in commissioning their Belle Epoque remodels, but that's beside the point. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider liking and subscribe to help the channel grow. It really means a lot. We're closing in on 1,500 subs, and from there, 2,000. If you've already subscribed and want to support me in other ways, I have channel memberships available for as little as $3 a month. Thank you so much for watching, and let's get right back to the show. Returning back to Italy, we've secured revolutionary control over the north of the peninsula and the island of Sicily. Now they need to sort out that problem with Austria. Realistically, even if they manage to beat the Austrian army, itself a major hurdle, This is going to be very difficult, especially with the occupation of Rome. Thus, what I'm thinking is that Italy agrees to recognize Austria and Lombardy and return the city of Rome to the Pope. From there, Italy decides to rest a bit, rebuild. The campaign into Naples can wait, at least for now. The country needs to industrialize and modernize. In addition, it needs to establish a government, preferably quickly. Now, the Roman Republic and Island of Sicily both had rather radical constitutions for the era, which will translate into their goals with Italy. As a result, what I'm imagining is that Italy adopts a federal model with autonomy for cities like Florence, Milan, Turin, etc. Rome and Naples will also be promised this when Italy gets their hands on those cities. It would also likely have a very small property requirement, if any. In terms of legislation with the federalist model, I would expect to see an upper house for each state/province to elect their chosen representatives, and then a parliamentary system making up the lower house. Now, when Germany united under a federal model like we're depicting here, the Chancellor of the German Empire was always the Prime Minister of Prussia. Think of it like the governor of California becoming Speaker of the House by default. Of course, the Kaiser still had the real power anyway, so it is a little bit moot. In contrast, that would be unacceptable to Italy, especially the revolutionary governments in Rome, Milan, and Sicily. Thus, while the king would likely still have quite a bit of power, especially since he did push for the unification himself, the legislation and its power would be much more fairly distributed. Now, from 1849 on, Italy has to modernize and fast. Its economy and literacy are both incredibly small compared to the other great powers, except for Russia, of course. Now, to Italy's credit, they knew that even in our timeline. However, their efforts were less than successful, and as a result, the country remained much more agricultural, and still less than half of the country was even literate on the eve of World War I, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. However, it is also worth noting that in 1861, Camillo Bensour, the Count of Cavour, was elected Prime Minister in our timeline. Prior to the premiership, Cavour laid out a series of necessary economic reforms and rose to power on them, but he died before he was able to fully put it into practice. As a result, Italy's modernization was blunted and factionalized. However, if Cavour were, say, to be elected 10 years earlier and actually have time to implement his agenda in full... Now, granted, Cavour at this time was dealing with the partisan rivalries of both the left and the right, but given the success of the left with the radical unification of the War of Independence, I think he could rally the right behind him as a more modern conservative figure. However, he wasn't the most democratic. He would meddle in elections and frequently ignored his coalition partners. For the sake of parties, Italy actually had a habit of loose coalition governments for the most part. In addition, what political factions existed in the country were more or less loose groupings of vaguely left or right-leaning notables. They weren't groups like the British Liberal Party or even the Republican Union in 1870s France. However, while overt partisanship is obviously dangerous, as voters have their rights expanded and their economic needs and questions of centralization and federalism emerge, more defined political parties are simply inevitable. Now, nationalism was the consensus among the Italian people at this point, but many of them had wanted a confederation or a loose union, not necessarily a centralized country. As a result, that will be something to contend with. In our world, the first full-on political party in Italy was the Socialist Party, and I could see that being the case here. However, I would also see the federalist question becoming a clear driver of partisan politics, much like in a certain other country known for its pizza. In fact, what about all those Italian immigrants to the US? Well, see, I'm not sure. See, immigrants tend to move where there's a higher standard of living and better opportunities for their kids, and that is a very good thing. But at the same time, as countries modernize and people realize how much better other countries can be, you also still see them move around. For example, this hyphenated American cartoon that I love using when I'm talking about nativism in the States, that's in response to French Americans, not just the Italians and the Irish. And we would hardly put France at the same level of poverty or desperation that Italy and Ireland were famously going through at this point, would we? Thus, with our Super Italy, I could actually see there being even more immigrants to the US. It's just that now there's more immigrants going to Italy as well. Since we're still aiming for a superpower Italy, we should probably also get Naples on board with this whole thing. Thus, we'll have some form of Garibaldi's expedition of the Thousand take place sometime around 1852, while the Kingdom of Sicily is still reeling from the War of Independence and the island's revolt. This is stretching a lot of things, but still, Italy needs the whole peninsula on board if it wants to actually make a name for itself at least. Naples would likely have to be broken up into 2 states to at least fit in with the federal model, and the city itself would gain autonomy, but this is still worth talking about. Now, for the most part, all we've done is pull Italian history forward by a few years, so when do we turn them into a superpower? Well, we are still working on that part, but we should also consider that with a few more years of effective government and stronger modernization efforts will culminate. While Italy probably isn't closing that GDP per capita gap in the decade, it could at least begin a more rapid industrialization throughout the 1840s and 50s. I found a paper from Cambridge that more or less says that the number of Frenchmen working in primary industries, farming, mining, etc., was around 50% in 1876. If we can get Italy on a similar path to that, I think they'd be in a pretty decent position. Maybe not on the same level as France, Italy still had about 10 million less people, but that's still a much more diverse economy and likely a stronger one in terms of industrial factories and other secondary goods. This will also allow them to more effectively lay down railroads and modernize their logistics and army. Still likely a bit optimistic, but whatever. Regardless, Italy still has land to get a hold of. Jumping back to the 1850s, Italy declared a second war on Austria in order to seize what's left of Lombardy Venetia. And unlike in our world, they have no intention of giving up land to France to make it happen. This time, the unified Italy is in a much better position to mobilize a pure army to Austria of around 100,000, and for good measure will make sure they get their modern guns. Italy, for its part, is able to push into the northeast. Now, Italy still isn't in a position to make this a 6-month thing like the Germans or French were. On their own, I would fully expect this conflict to take north of 9 months, possibly even a year. But for the sake of the scenario, we'll still have them win out in the end. Now, this defeat of Austria will have implications for the rest of Europe. After all, they've now been beaten twice by the new kid on the block. As a result, Austria will start its own attempts to modernize much sooner, while this will exacerbate tensions with the Ottomans, Russians, and especially Prussians, since Austria now just looks weak. How this goes, I can't really say. However, Austria likely still struggles to modernize to the same level of Prussia, or in this timeline, even Italy. Whether that leads to another Austro-Italian war over the Croatian claims, or Austria somehow manages to whip itself into shape and beat back the Prussians, I don't know. Though to be fair, if I got my ass beat by Italy twice, I'd probably do some self-reflection too. Now, Italy is far from satiated. It would likely begin looking to African expansion quickly after the conquest of Venice, since it's still trying to exert itself as a great power. While it would like to compete in the carving of the Ottomans in the Balkans, it's just not ready for that yet. However, now that it's a unified state sooner and frankly stronger than it was, I would expect them to turn toward North Africa. Tunisia would likely be the obvious strategic goal since it would help them prevent a French invasion while still being a decent place for settlement, a common goal of European empires at the time and a big reason for the later conquest of Libya. In addition, Italy tries to gain some concessions from Egypt, but there's a Britain in the way. Something that I want to touch on is the Crimean War, which started in 1853. See, the Turks weren't having a great time of things, and Russia really wanted them to have an even worse time of things. Now, the Russians are traditionally at the title of protector of the Ottoman Christians, ostensibly putting the Ottomans in their sphere of influence. The Ottomans were traditionally still seen as a great power, but after the 1830s, they consistently required outside help to maintain their empire, so I kind of stopped counting them after the whole thing with Ali. Regardless, Russia had plans to kick the Ottomans basically out of the Balkans, and in our timeline, Emperor Napoleon III attempted to supplant the Tsar's role as a protector of Christians and preserve the Ottoman power. Here, though, the odds of King Henry III, or if we go with Lamartine, him, demanding that particular concession from the Turks is kind of slim. In addition, in our timeline, Sardinia joined up with the French and British in an attempt to win over their support and unification. However, in this timeline, if Russia starts carving into the Ottoman Empire, Italy's path forward isn't so clear. While they wouldn't want the Tsar to be able to compete in the Mediterranean, Italy would be very interested in taking land from the Ottomans. For example, the land surrounding Palestine would be very interesting for an upstart regional power that wanted to avoid paying British dues in the Suez Canal. For the sake of this scenario, we'll say that when the Russians start getting ready to attack the Ottomans in the 1850s, France opts to stay out of it. We'll say that they're expanding elsewhere and aren't in a position to care too much, while Britain desperately moves to preserve the Ottomans. Italy, in contrast, is very eager to see what it can get out of this deal and begins talks with Russia. Tsar Nicholas desperately needs an ally if he's going to face down Britain, so he agrees to hear them out. The Italian demands are simple, but consequential. They want the Levant, Libya, and Albania. The former would allow them to circumvent British control over Egypt, the latter would allow them to trap Austria in the Adriatic whenever they wanted, and Libya would make them look bigger on the map. However, the fact is that Italy is more at risk than Russia is, and Tuscany is sticking its neck out to try this gamble. As a result, Russia accepts. Now, the Crimean War is a video unto itself, but at the very least now, Italy needs to buckle up and prepare for a real test, because it just signed up to fight its biggest trade partner and the largest navy on the planet. However, without France, the Mediterranean isn't entirely locked up, just mostly locked up. Russia invades Romania on schedule, and the British Navy in the Dardanelles has to deal with the Italian landings in Epirus and the attempted adventure in the Levant. Now, Italy has a decent army in this timeline. Hell, they're probably doing a bit better in the naval war, but they're not competing with the Royal Navy unless the Ottomans completely collapse. As a result, when the war ends, the negotiations aren't quite what Italy wants. They're able to get the Levant and Libya, but their control over Albania is vetoed by Austria, and even Russia wasn't happy about the prospect. The only reason they're able to get the Levant is more or less due to the fact that Britain still owns the Suez, meaning that Italy is the only country actually able to get around it. Okay, so I'm gonna be real. As I've done my digging for this video, I'm starting to see why certain other YouTubers took so long to get to the topic. Namely, I actually think that Italy was kind of SOL. By the time it united in our world, France and Britain had already started carving into North Africa, the Russians and Austria were a mere decade from carving the Balkans up, and geographically, if Italy ever wants to expand out of the Mediterranean, it either needs to take Morocco or the Levant, And while both would work, the former is still a much bigger gap to bridge to lands actually worth exploiting. In contrast, it is a massive stretch that Italy would be able to get the Levant like I've depicted here, but that would allow them to push into the Middle East and even other parts of Africa and Asia. For example, now they could reasonably buy the Philippines from Spain. I'm not going to go that route, but it is an option. If they try to build an empire in East Africa, this also allows them much better and cheaper logistics. In addition, they were demographically, industrially, and technologically behind every other great power except for Russia and Japan. And Japan only opened up as Italy was finishing unifying. Dead to rights, Italy just had no more room to grow by the time it expanded. Even if it took over everything it wanted from Austria in the 1840s, which would be more or less impossible, it would still need several years in order to catch up. As a result, this particular video is largely based on the assumption that unifying 12 years earlier gives Italy a lot of time to grow as a united economy and modernize incredibly effectively. With that out of the way, by the 1860s, Italy is in a much better spot than in our timeline. While in real life they had just burst onto the scene and had to get bailed out with Prussia and France in order to get what they wanted, here they've had about 12 to 18 years of unification and industrial growth, in addition to the greater military success. However, in the 1860s, Prussia would be starting to aim for unified Germany, and Austria is standing in the way. Thus, there's a chance of Italy still getting involved in the Brothers' War for one final fight with Austria in order to secure their Adriatic claims. However, this would likely be seen as too far by this point by France, who I've kept out of the way specifically because Italy would struggle in a two-front war like this. While France is less expansionist than it was in our timeline, it still let a lot slide from Italy, but after 12 years of constant expansionism, including a colony that's pointed right at French Algeria, it's likely running out of patience. Of course, that begs the question of a Franco-Italian war over the state of Tunisia and Corsica. While such a war would be possible, unless Italy spent the entire 1850s preparing specifically for it, I wouldn't put it as winnable. At this point, France still has the second largest navy on the planet and is more industrialized than Italy. As a result, any French-Italian conflict would be over Italy occupying Rome around the 1860s or 70, which would deeply anger Catholics in France and Austria, but would be a fait accompli too quickly to really matter. But what does matter is the Franco-Prussian War. How much of that was the personal matter of Bismarck and Napoleon III? I would argue not too much, since Germany still did want to claim Alsace-Lorraine in order to appease the South German states. Here, Germany could wind up tag-teaming France with Germany in order to claim Corsica. In addition, they might be able to push for parts of Algeria. This likely results in France collapsing to some kind of republic or a kingdom, depending on who came out on top in 1848, just because at this point it's a habit of theirs, but I'm not sure what it entails at this point, and frankly, it's not really our problem. Now, by the 1870s, here's what Italy is looking like. It has Palestine, Libya, Tunisia, Corsica, and even parts of Algeria. It has certainly established itself as a major player. However, there's one more thing it lacks: a major Asian colony, and that is a crucial part of being a European great power at this point. Now, realistically, anything I say here is entirely arbitrary. Hell, at this stage, Korea and parts of Japan are still possible concessions. They just be hard mode. However, what I'm going to do is have Italy lay claim to the island of Hainan in a Sino-Italian war. This would be a major boon to Italy's prestige and allow them influence in China, but would be the extent of the Italian Empire in Asia. The other great powers would definitely raise a stink, but there's not a lot of room for them to complain when they own 60% of Southeast Asia, the entire Indian subcontinent, or have a massive land border with China. Now, the Sino-Italian War would likely be another major humiliation for the Qing, but I'm not sure how extreme this one would be seen as. Now, importantly, in the 1870s, the German Empire hosted a conference surrounding the division of the Ottoman Empire's Balkan territories due to the Treaty of San Stefano. Italy wasn't invited in our world, but here it is absolutely bullying its way in, and it will have opinions. Namely, I suspect that this is when they demand their protectorate over Albania, and possibly even get it if Austria still gets to occupy Bosnia. This would definitely put Italy and Austria on different sides in the European balance of power, however. Austria has learned not to underestimate Italy, but Rome's expansionism is getting out of hand. In contrast, Italy has friends in Russia and in Germany, while France likely has opinions about them at this point. Once the Berlin Conference or similar event comes up to divide Africa, Italy's not going to raise too much of a stink. They'd absolutely push for the Horn of Africa like in our timeline so as to supply the Hainan colony, but that would likely be it. After all they need is to legitimize their claims to what they already own, and they've secured that by now. However, the Italian conquest of Ethiopia is likely more successful, possibly even taking the country over in full. Now, Italian East Africa as a colony likely isn't worth much, and is more or less a trade port for the Italian Empire. However, I want to point out that as much fun as making countries bigger on the map is, Italy was horrific in its conduct in this war, and would be just as bad as all the other colonial powers were in its conquest and suppression. If anything, Italy would be on the harsher side just because Hainan and Ethiopia are very highly populated regions. Jumping ahead to World War I, it's hard to say what the alliance system looks like. Italy still has claims on the Austrian coast, while it has little quarrel with France at this point. France, meanwhile, has a great deal of quarrel with Italy for similar reasons to their rivalry with Germany. However, both Italy and France want to ally with Russia due to Germany and Austria respectively. The question is, can France stomach working with Italy at this point? Where does Britain fit in? Have we made Italy strong enough that Britain is leaning toward Germany of all powers? I'm honestly not entirely sure. Or perhaps France is simply too angry at the humiliation by both Germany and Italy, and has made its plans to reconquer both very obvious, leaving Italy to ally with the Germans. But with that, I think I need to end the scenario here. As the sun rises on 1900, Italy stands poised to take the world by storm. It has amassed a powerful colonial empire across the world. The Italian army is feared and respected in cities such as Vienna and Paris, while the Regina Marina is a powerful force in the South China Sea. A federalist democracy, it has become one of the fastest modernizing economies in Europe and the world, and its growth shows very few signs of slowing down. However, as tensions mount, its fate is uncertain, and the Italians must tread carefully to preserve their new European power. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Before we go, I just want to give a quick shout out to channel members Dubs Main, Listenberg Patriot, and Grimm's Walt. In fact, all three of them have joined at the exclamation point level, so seriously, Dubs Main, Listenberg Patriot, and Grimm's Walt, thank you. And I hope everyone tunes in next week to explore another alternate world.